Welcome to Trauma Talk. I'm Cheryl, a teacher, hypnobirthing teacher, doula and birth keeper, and if you don't know me already, I love talking about trauma, but in particular birth trauma, even though it's all linked together. And that's what this podcast is for, to talk about trauma, to talk about birth trauma, and explore how that all links together. I'm not from a clinical background and I don't have a medical degree, but I'm talking from the point of view of human experience, my own human experience, and the things that I've learned and the experiences of those who I've been lucky enough to support in their journeys to, more often than not, a healing birth, which is what they were setting out to do. So thank you so much for being here. If you have any suggestions for what we should be talking about, or any suggestions for guests, or you want to put yourself forward, then please get in touch at cheryl@simplynatal.co.uk, or find me on Instagram or Facebook as Simply Natal, the Healing Birth Doula. Enjoy. Well, welcome back to Trauma Talk. I've been trying to decide where to go next with this. There's so many things that I can talk about. But in some ways, I understand why it makes sense to talk about my birth trauma first and foremost. And not only that, because I can talk about what the symptoms of birth trauma are because of my symptoms, as well as talk about what other people's symptoms could be. I can talk about the causes of birth trauma because of what caused my birth trauma, even though that might look different for other people. But there are lots of similarities across stories. And even though all of our stories might be completely different and completely different things and completely different situations that have caused us to have that trauma response, there's so many similarities with the reasons why we end up in that position where we feel that way. So let's start there, hey. And let me just offer you permission, if you need it, to take a break at any point, to not continue listening to this till the end. If it doesn't feel like the right time for you or you just don't want to, that's fine. Skip this one altogether if you like and move on to a different one. Because if you're fresh out of your own birth trauma, or even if you're a long way past your birth trauma and you just haven't had the space, support, or time to process it yet, then listening to someone else's birth trauma can be hard going. So please take care of yourself first and foremost. So where do I start? I mean, it's my story, so you'd think I can do this. I suppose my story, as much as we could keep on going back and back and back to my own birth, that would take far too long. But in terms of my perinatal experiences, we can start with my first pregnancy, because my first birth was not my first pregnancy. My first pregnancy had been the year before and had ended at 7 weeks. And it was a long time before I connected these things all together. But it makes so much sense now, knowing what I know and seeing what I see, because seeing other people have very similar experiences, I can see how these things link together so importantly. But we are told by society that an early loss, it doesn't matter, is not important and shouldn't be talked about. In fact, we're encouraged, aren't we, to not even tell people that we're pregnant before 12 weeks, because if anything happens before then, no one needs to know. So, I like to challenge that a little bit now and encourage people to tell others when they feel like they need support, and to tell others whenever it feels right for them. We don't have to comply with this imaginary time limit that society has given us. Because if we do have a loss, in the early days before 12 weeks, then actually we need an awful lot of support that is very hard to ask for if we've never told anyone. So my story really starts on reflection way back then when I was pregnant with a much wanted baby. And I'd had a positive pregnancy test and I'd told my sister, and I had so much fear already at that point, so much fear, because it felt like such a massive responsibility. And when it's your body doing this thing, it does feel like a massive responsibility sometimes. And then I started bleeding. And of course, that felt like failure because I had a lot of deconditioning to do at that point as well. So, I interpreted it as my fault and my failure. And then did another pregnancy test a few days after that, and it was positive, and I was like, oh, I thought I'd miscarried, and then I hadn't, or at least the process hadn't finished. I don't know, and I'll never know, but I was still testing positive for a little while, so another week or so, and then eventually the bleeding came back, and it was worse, and it was heavy, and it was sad, and it was final. It felt final. I went to the early pregnancy unit, and I felt as though I wanted to have like a scan to just tell me that it was definitely no baby there, because I felt so messed up from having these signs of miscarrying and then still having a positive test. And what does it mean? And is it one of those stories where people think they're miscarried, but actually it's not? And there is still a baby there, and I wasn't sure, and I couldn't trust myself. And I thought it would help if I had a scan. But when I went to the early pregnancy unit, the midwife just said, there's no point having a scan. You're having a miscarriage. That's what this is. And I was like, oh. And that felt quite final. Right. Okay, then that's what this is. And, kind of just put a smile on and accepted it and went, okay, that's what it is. But not many people knew about it, obviously. I told people later on. I told people when I was pregnant again that I'd had a miscarriage, because it felt like I was allowed to then. It was validated because, look, I'm pregnant now and it's working out. So I'm allowed to tell you that I had a miscarriage before. For some people, it could be completely unrelated. Like, you could have a miscarriage, you could deal with it, you could process that, and then go on to have another pregnancy. Maybe, I suppose, I don't know. It seems to me like a lot of people carry that loss into the next experience, or all of their next experiences. And I certainly did. I just didn't know that meant I needed to do some work, that I needed to do some processing. I didn't know that that's what it meant. So I just carried on regardless. And in my pregnancy with Riley, I spent a lot of time worrying about miscarriage, but not really knowing or acknowledging that that's what it was. I just thought, because I'd already failed once, it was more likely that I was going to fail again. And that fear of going to the toilet and looking to see whether there's blood there, that never went away. I mean, I think I was still having that horrible sinking feeling like most of the way through my pregnancy, at least until 20 weeks anyway. So I needed a lot of reassurance. I went in for monitoring a couple of times. It was anxiety though. It wasn't reduced movements. I just wanted to know my baby was okay. And yeah, the pregnancy was filled with lots of anxiety in that respect. I wasn't thinking about birth. I wasn't particularly afraid of birth. I knew nothing about it. So it was hard to be afraid of something that I didn't know. I'd done research, the sort of research where you find out about all the things that can go wrong, don't you? Because that had been the kind of mindset that I'd been in for a lot of my life, looking for the stuff that can go wrong and then seeing if there's any way that you can avoid the thing going wrong that you most fear. But of course, knowing what I know now about how the mind works and how the mind and body are connected, the stuff that you learn about in hypnobirthing, I realised that all I was doing was planting these negative ideas in my head and causing myself anguish because of them. So it doesn't surprise me that I experienced the birth as traumatic because of that. So anyway, moving forward to not knowing anything about birth, didn't know a thing. Thought I knew some stuff, but it wasn't anywhere near the sort of stuff that we should know, that we need to know. Basic physiology, for example, how to feel supported and safe. Didn't know that either. And that takes a little bit of self-reflection anyway. What makes me feel safe? It's hard to know what that is unless you've done a bit of work on yourself already. So I got to 40 weeks and that came and went, didn't it? A friend of mine was due after me and had a baby before me. I remember being devastated, truly devastated that that felt so unfair and what was wrong with me, because of course I didn't understand anything about due dates and why it's not relevant at all. I didn't feel like I could just relax and wait for my baby to come. I felt like I ought to be doing something. So, I mean, I didn't do loads of things. I probably ate a tin of pineapple, and now I know that that's a load of rubbish. I probably had a curry, but not hot enough to do anything anyway. And, felt this immense pressure to make this baby be born. What is my body not doing right? And of course, now I know that my body was doing everything right. It was doing everything it needed to do. Except I had that dreaded appointment, didn't I? That 41-week appointment, which it was then 8 years ago. Now people are having these conversations way earlier. Okay, we're going to book you in for induction. And I remember thinking, I don't really want that. Doesn't sound like something that I would enjoy very much. I'd read some stories. I didn't feel like induction was for me. But I also didn't know that I could just say, no, thanks. I don't want to be induced. I thought that was what had to happen. Oh, and also I had, in that last week of pregnancy, I had 4 sweeps. 4 sweeps. So I think I was offered a sweep on when I was 40 weeks. And then I just kept going back because I was like, well, nothing's happening. So my body isn't working. Make it work. Switch it on. Do that thing and press the button and make it work. Because I didn't understand physiology. I didn't understand that bodies just do it in their own time, and that fiddling about with it doesn't do anything unless your body is already ready. So I had 4 sweeps of varying success in that. I think the very first one, she wasn't really able to do anything. And then, it turned out that my cervix was softening. It was a little bit open. She was able to perform a sweep. It didn't hurt because my cervix was already soft. So I think the reason why I hadn't gone into labour was because of baby's position. But of course, someone did mention that to me and I didn't really understand an awful lot about it. My midwife had said, just go on all fours, just go on your all fours all the time. And I was like, right, okay, I don't really know what I'm doing, don't really understand. And I hadn't done enough in pregnancy to support him getting into a good position. So doing that in the final week or so of pregnancy is unlikely to make a huge difference. I do believe now, and I mean, I had a suspicion then as well, that he was properly wedged in my pelvis. And one of the reasons I know is because when he was born, one of his ears was bent over, and it stayed like that for a few weeks, as though he'd been wedged in the side of my pelvis with his ear squashed. And he couldn't move. He couldn't get into a better position. And that's the reason why he wasn't in a better position, because we know babies get into the best position they can. And he just couldn't move into a better position. So he did that in labour. And so when I eventually did go into labour, and I realised I'm giving you a lot of like context beforehand, but I think that's important. It gives you an idea of my headspace and where I was at. That's not going to be the same for everyone. Some people are in a really good space leading up to their birth. Some people are not. Some people's trauma is happening way before. And I suppose in some ways I'd had some little experiences of trauma, like the miscarriage for a start, and the kind of generally just feeling really anxious and like my body wasn't doing a good enough job. These kind of micro traumas, really. But not anything massive, not a massive experience of trauma. Maybe some like internalized feelings, like the feeling of not going into labor on time, and that being something that I needed to do desperately, and that it meant I was a failure if I didn't. So I think that kind of did impact on me. I internalized that and made that about me, rather than understanding it as just something that is to do with birth and as not knowing when labor is going to happen. So I was booked in for induction actually the Monday after he was born. He was born on the Sunday and he's booked in on the Monday, and I really didn't want induction, but I didn't know I could say no. So all this pressure. Had this other sweep on like the Friday. I woke up Saturday morning about 6 a.m. And had my first contraction. And this is funny. I know Sally Ann on The Ultimate Birth Partner talks about this as well, like this idea of, especially when it's your first time round, you have that first contraction and it's like, all of that adrenaline, all of that excitement, all of that, oh my God, finally, this is happening. And actually what we end up doing is slowing things down rather than just accepting it and letting it happen. And I very much in my head counted that as the start of labour, when really, from a mindset perspective, I should have just been ignoring it as long as possible and getting on with things. But I somehow thought that I could think my way through this process of labour, which is impossible, and that I could make it happen quicker somehow if I just forced myself to think about it. So I got up and went downstairs and was like, right, okay, let's make this happen. You can't do that with labour. Comes in its own time. So it's I was waiting to see whether it was going to carry on, of course. And the thing is, every time those contractions were coming, I was afraid of them. And I was saying, like, I was giving my body such mixed messages. I was saying, come on, let's do this. And then also going, oh no, but I don't like it very much. I don't like it when it hurts. And I'm not particularly fond of this experience at all. And so that probably actually just dragged it out longer than it needed to be. I remember every time I sat on the toilet, it got more intense. So of course I just wouldn't sit in that position and I just avoided it. I remember just pushing it away. It's something that I say to my doula clients now. It's so important for us to accept the feelings, the sensations, and thank them and say, yes, good, this is what I need to happen. Relax into it and accept it and welcome them. Because I definitely didn't do that. I pushed it away and I was like, oh, no. I was far too much in my logical mind. So eventually, anyway, hours and hours later, which it literally was, because I think I was at home for about 12 hours, maybe a bit longer, before I decided to go in to the birth centre. And of course, I was met with, let's do an examination. And for me, that examination was like some sort of test. And I've spent a lifetime, by the way, trying to pass tests. So, I've been pretty good at that. I've hyper focused, if you will, on passing tests. So when I got the vaginal examination and I was told you're only 2 to 3 centimeters. Oh my word, I was devastated, because what had I been doing all this work for? And of course, that use of the word only was really devastating too, because it felt so minimizing for the work that my body had done already, rather than, wow, look what your body's done already. I'm pretty sure actually at my last sweep I was already 2 centimeters as well. Like I say, my cervix seemed to be ready. It was the baby's head not pressing down on it that was preventing labour starting. So it felt like I hadn't done anything. It felt like I hadn't done any work at all. And I didn't understand physiology enough to know that that didn't mean that my body wasn't working hard. So I cried and obviously carrying on. I was encouraged to go home. Like, I was told to think about it and go home, but that felt even worse. Like, I'd gone there because, and I realised now the reason why I'd gone there is because I felt safe going somewhere at that time. It felt like I couldn't continue to labour at home. I needed to be in the place that was going to give birth. And in lots of ways that makes sense. So I didn't really want to go, although I felt like I was supposed to, like I'd gone there prematurely and I shouldn't be there yet. But as it turns out, because at the consensual sweep, I was at the consensual vaginal examination, I was given a non-consensual sweep, and didn't even recognise at the time that that was not a good thing. But what that did was caused my contractions to get closer together. So within about 10 minutes of having that sweep, I was experiencing things differently. Now, I don't know what would have happened. I don't know if that was a good thing, or whether it would have been longer, or whether it would have been better without that. I don't know. But I know it felt like something changed. So, I stayed and I bounced on my ball, and then I got on the gas and air. And actually, when I got on the gas and air, I loved that stuff. And I would have stayed in that bit for forever. That bit. And I remember saying in between contractions, oh, I understand why people say toothache is worse than labour, because toothache doesn't stop, does it? It's constant. But in between the contractions, I was coping really well, actually. During the contractions felt hard. In between, I was fine. And, that's pretty normal. It's what I see quite a lot now as well. But what I was doing in my head was building up, but how am I going to get through the next one? I was okay at that time. Like, there was no evidence there at that point that I was going to have a traumatic experience. And in fact, in lots of ways, it was absolutely fine, that bit. As things progressed, though, I got more out of control, as in I didn't feel safe, and I wasn't having people say the right things to me, like reminding me that I was safe, for example, which is really simple, but something that, I tend to try and say quite a lot of births that I'm at now, because even if it doesn't look obvious that someone doesn't feel unsafe, it's not going to cause any harm to just tell them that they're safe. You are safe. This is safe. Everything about this is safe. It's okay. Birth is safe. Your baby is safe. And I don't mean saying that if it's really untrue, but most of the time that is true. So, got into the pool, and I was okay, but I also wasn't okay. I was thinking, how am I going to keep on going with this? I had no timeline in my head. I had no end in sight, and I had no one reminding me what it was for either. You're going to meet your baby soon or anything like that. So as things got more intense, which is bound to happen during labour, it's bound to happen, I wasn't accepting of that fact, probably because I didn't feel safe enough to let myself go there. I expressed that I was feeling a bit unnerved, I think, because the midwife offered me Meptid, which was in my birth plan. And I accepted it, even though I was thinking, I probably don't need this right now, just yet. I accepted it anyway, because I was just thinking, well, it's only going to make it easier. Except I think on reflection, actually the Meptid sent me a bit wappy because, you know, it's an opioid medication, and I didn't feel good after taking that. And that's when my head started doing all weird things. So when I was experiencing the intensity of labour and it felt like it was too much for me to cope with, I imagined myself being in medieval times and being tortured, and thinking, oh, I know why people begged for death now. I know that. Imagine Guy Fawkes, like that's what's coming into my head. At one point I did vocalize and I said, how do people do this when they know their baby's dead? Because of course that was the echo of my previous loss, because that had been what was on my mind the whole time through pregnancy. My baby, I couldn't quite believe I was going to get a baby at the end because I'd already failed. So was I going to get a baby at the end? I don't know. I'd felt a bit safer after 24 weeks. And, you know, I knew that I had a healthy baby that was growing well. But of course, I also knew all of the stories about how things can go wrong. So my brain was taking me to those places in my most vulnerable time. And it was taking me to, yes, this baby might not even be alive. And I might be doing all of this and not give birth to a baby that's alive. And I was experiencing that as though it was really happening, because that's how powerful our minds are. And when we know that's how powerful our minds are, then that makes sense. But to me at the time, I didn't know. It didn't make sense that my brain was going to this place, and it felt so bad. It felt like I already was experiencing that, like I was already aware that my baby was not going to make it through this labour. As of course that fear built, so did the pain, because my body was resisting everything that was happening. And I just felt like I was screaming, help me, on the inside, and no one was offering me any help. I got really, really overwhelmed. I think my baby would have been born sooner if his position had been better. I was really waiting for him to do that turn. His head was sideways, so waiting for him to do that turn so that he could be born. So my body needed to do really powerful contractions to make that happen. And I just didn't seem to cope very well with that sensation and with the letting go and letting my body do the thing, because I didn't feel safe, because I didn't feel safe enough to do that. It's easy for me to say that now, but when I've been explaining my birth story in the past, before I knew what I know now, it sounds like it's just about the pain. And it felt for a long time for me like it was just about the pain, and I couldn't cope with the pain, and the pain was awful, and the pain was traumatic. And yes, it was. But I realize now that the pain felt the way it did because of how unsafe I felt. And not just because I didn't feel the level of safety and support that I could have felt in the room, but because I didn't feel safe in my body from the very beginning. I'd never felt safe in my body. My whole life I hadn't felt safe in my body. So that's a big thing. That's the big thing that we can't do anything about if we're already in labour. And then we realise that we have never felt safe in our body. You know, you can't fix that there and then anyway. If you've had a lifetime of anxiety and other we could go into lots of other reasons why people might not feel safe in their body. But whatever the reason, if we're going into pregnancy and labour and birth with that feeling of not being safe in our body, then there's not an awful lot that anyone else can do for us that can make us feel safe. Yes, I think there are things that people could have done for me to make me feel more safe and potentially to get me through that without being so traumatized. But I realized that a lot of my experience comes down to my psychological experience, what I was already taking in with me, as well as how I felt on the day. But I only know that now. I didn't understand that then. I couldn't separate it out and understand it properly then. And I think in some ways, regardless of things happening in labour, and oftentimes there are things that are happening in labour that exacerbate those feelings. So sometimes people are still going into birth feeling unsafe, and really that's where it begins, and then something happens and then that exacerbates the feeling of not being safe. So essentially, if we're talking about what causes birth trauma, it comes back to safety, and whatever it is that's causing that feeling of being unsafe is the root of us feeling unsafe and the root of our trauma, because we can't experience trauma if we feel completely safe. If we're completely safe all of the time, physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually safe all of the time, then we can't be traumatized. That's not how it works. It happens in a moment of feeling unsafe, whether that's for a moment or for a long period of time. That's when the trauma can occur. So yes, there were parts of my labour that were fine and felt okay, but generally my feeling of not feeling safe was persistent throughout. And that only got worse as I got closer to transition, of course, and to the birth itself, because that felt very out of control, and I wasn't able or willing to let go enough. I didn't feel safe enough to let go enough to trust my body. And why would I trust my body? We've been given messages our whole lives to not trust our bodies, especially as women and people socialized as women. We are told not to trust our bodies. Plus, I'd already had a miscarriage before, so there you go. Knock a bit more trust out of my body. So, where am I? I'm approaching the birth, and I remember calling out and saying, but when? How much longer? How much longer? And the midwife said, oh, could be 20 minutes, could be 2 hours. And I just thought, no. Like that, the thought of 2 hours felt so bad and so wrong and didn't help me or serve me at all. It was 2 hours, but yeah, that it didn't make those 2 hours any easier. So at one point I was really panicking. And the thing is, during a contraction, it's really hard to panic. So then when the contraction finished, I was panicking in between, and I was told at that point, you're panicking now, Cheryl. I remember thinking, oh, right, okay, mustn't panic, mustn't show signs of panic. And so from that point onwards, I only panicked internally. I didn't panic outside at all. So no one knew I was panicking, but I was panicking. I was panicking completely all of the time inside. That was pretty terrifying. There was also one point where my sister, because, probably out of everyone in the room, she knew me the best. She was concerned for me. She knew I was panicking. She didn't know how to help me. And she asked the midwife, is there anything else that you can do for her? I'd already had the second shot of Meptid by that point. So it only sent me more wappy, hadn't it? I'm not sure whether it helped at all, to be honest. The midwife said, across me, I was in the birth pool, across me, said, oh, don't worry, she won't remember any of this. And if there was a moment that I was going to pick out of the whole of the birth experience, it would be that one for really consolidating the fact that this was going to be traumatic. Because from that point on, as soon as she'd said I wouldn't remember any of this, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I couldn't forget it. I couldn't let myself forget it because of what she'd said. Because if I forgot it, then I would be dismissing myself and this whole experience that had been horrible and felt dreadful, as though it didn't matter. And I remember thinking, I can't forget it. I absolutely can't forget this. I need to remember this. And I mean, maybe that is when the trauma response really kicked in, because part of trauma is that need to remember so that we can avoid that experience again, which is very much what it felt like. Like, I have to remember this because I can never go through this again. I'm not sure I would survive a second time. So, well, eventually my baby was born at 10:52 a.m. on that Sunday, the day before his induction was planned. My induction, or his, both of us. And yeah, I remember feeling like a tree trunk. He felt like a tree trunk as he was being born, just massive. He wasn't massive, but I don't know whether that was the kind of position that he came out, and also the force with which I was pushing him out. Because I'd asked at one point, when are you going to tell me when to push? Because again, I didn't know anything. I didn't know anything about the expulsive reflex. I didn't know anything about bodies doing this job and what it was supposed to be like. So, the midwife said, push if you want to. And I was like, well, yeah, I want to, because I want it to be over. Just want it to be over. So is there going to be a baby sometime soon, please? And I pushed and I pushed and I pushed like my life depended on it, because it did, because I didn't know how many more minutes I could deal with this feeling. And for a long time afterwards, I really blamed myself for that as well, because I had a second degree tear, and I just thought maybe I wouldn't have torn so badly if I hadn't have pushed so hard. And granted, I know a secondary tear is not the worst type of tear, and that I'm very lucky in lots of ways. But it felt like it just compounded my trauma. It compounded my sense of failure, that I couldn't do this without tearing. I couldn't do this without feeling this way. And, on paper, I did it. I mean, I did do it. Of course I did. But on paper, it looks like a very straightforward birth, just the way that I planned for, actually, just the way that I wanted, even in a birth pool, in a birth centre. My baby was here, wasn't he? Except I wished I wasn't, because my baby came out and my baby was on me, and I just couldn't stop thinking, I can't believe I'm alive. I can't believe I'm still alive. When I'd already gone to that place in my head, I'd already gone to, I wish I wasn't here. I wish I was dead. I'd begged in my head for death. And then I know I had a baby, and I wasn't dead. And that left me in a very confusing state, because I wasn't sure I even wanted to be alive. And my baby was alive, and I hadn't expected my baby to be alive, even though there'd not been any signs of anything like that happening. I'd already taken myself there. So for weeks and weeks afterwards, I expected him to die, and I waited for it to happen, and I imagined it happening, and I imagined having to call an ambulance and perform CPR. Intrusive thoughts are us. And sometimes people experience that following birth trauma as well. Sometimes that's experienced even without birth trauma, though, those kind of intrusive thoughts and postnatal anxiety type symptoms. what I was experiencing was hypervigilance, like being on alert all of the time, like all of a sudden for no reason. Oh, what is it? All of a sudden wondering if he's okay, if I've left the room. Is he okay? Is he still breathing? I couldn't sleep. There are lots of things about my birth experience that could have been nicer, better. There are things that are down to the system and the way birth is dealt with in institutions. But ultimately, my head and the place that my head was in was the main reason why I experienced that birth was traumatic. And I wonder why nobody warned me that that could happen, because I'm not the first person, and I'm definitely not the last to have that kind of experience purely because of where my head is. In fact, it's a question they ask you when you book in anxiety and depression. I remember going in for reduced movements and them asking me, so you've got a history of anxiety and depression? And I was like, yeah. And I waited, and I thought there was going to be a conversation about that and what that means and what I can do. And nothing. It was just like, okay, well, we've got it written down on our form, so that's all that really matters. And I know that really all they were thinking about was that puts me at greater risk of postnatal depression, so they'll look out for that. When really, what I wanted to know is, how can I prevent that? How can I stop myself from being unwell after this baby's born? No one pointed that out to me. I'd never heard of birth trauma, and I discovered that in the first week or so after giving birth, because I couldn't understand how I felt the way I did. And I definitely wasn't depressed. I mean, I have been depressed since, but I wasn't depressed. That's not what I was experiencing. And I'd experienced depression before, so I knew that it wasn't depression. I remember thinking, though, that it felt a lot like grief, because I'd experienced the loss of my mum at 19. And I recognize this feeling. It feels like grief. It feels like I'm experiencing grief. And it turns out I was. I was grieving for the birth that I wanted and expected, and in some ways we could say deserved. In fact, I say that all the time, so I don't know why I hesitated with that. The birth I deserved, because I deserved to have a positive experience. I deserved to be in a good place when I met my baby. But I wasn't. And so I was grieving for that. And I was also grieving for, not feeling that joy that I'd expected to feel. I was grieving for lots of things, grieving for myself, grieving for my life, grieving for the start to parenthood that I wanted and expected. And in some ways, grieving for my baby that I was expecting to lose. Like, I wasn't expecting him to be okay. And I was grieving for him. I think someone called it anticipatory grief, which I haven't heard many people talk about, to be honest. So, in lots of ways, a unique story, I know, because having a birth centre birth in a pool that's relatively physiological, even though, of course, there's sweeps and stuff like that, but relatively physiological, straightforward, not have an intervention. It sounds like okay. It sounds like textbook. It sounds like that should be a birth that we can be happy with. And for some people, that is their dream experience. And for some people, with a different thing going on inside their head, a different narrative, that is the birth that they always wanted. But it wasn't for me. It was traumatic for me. And regardless of how your baby was born and the circumstances surrounding that, I think you'll find that there's lots of similarities in how we feel and why we feel that way. Feeling like failures for a start, feeling like we couldn't do it, feeling grief afterwards, feeling hypervigilance afterwards, feeling just like we didn't get what we expected. And I think those similarities across the board for people who've suffered with birth trauma, particularly when it's been around the birth itself, are really common. And when we go back into it, we can often find out that there was a feeling of not being safe in there somewhere. Now, I've supported people who've had births that have looked completely different to mine, lots more in the way of things happening that they didn't want to happen, and they didn't come away feeling traumatized. And I can only put that down to people feeling safe and held and having done the work already to help them feel safe in their body. It is different, it's experienced differently. And knowing what to expect from birth and knowing what to expect from the system and making your decisions based in safety and what you need for yourself make a huge difference to how we then feel when we are there in the moment, whatever that looks like to anyone else. So what message do I want to leave you with? I'm not sure whether I breathed properly all the way through there, by the way. I'm worried about getting upset, but also worried about not doing justice to the topic. Hopefully it feels as though you know me a little bit better and know my story a bit better. If you've got a similarity in your story that you want to share, then please let me know. The message that I want to give to birth professionals, anybody who works in and around birth really, is to make sure that we're not making assumptions about someone's birth experience just because it looks a certain way. Doesn't mean that it was traumatic or wasn't traumatic, and that we really should be basing that in people's experiences and the way they talk about their experience. Because any birth can be traumatic, and any birth doesn't have to be traumatic if we've got the right safety in place and the right support in place to carry us through. So thank you so much for listening to me go on about my story today. I hope you found something in it that's useful. Please let me know. Please share this with anyone who you think might benefit from hearing it. Take good care of yourself, because it can be hard to listen to these things. And yeah, if you're thinking that you don't want this type of experience for yourself and you haven't done anything about it yet, then please think very carefully about doing something for your own empowerment, doing something for your own feelings of safety, whatever that is and whatever that looks like. I'm not saying come and work with me, although you might want to, and that's okay. If you don't want to, that's also okay. Just go and do something. Do something and be prepared, because it can make a massive difference to your experience. Thank you so much. See you next time.